Namaste, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. This will not be a commentary, but rather the first of our debate series between two gentlemen who belong to somewhat different sides of the spectrum. So, on the one hand, we have Harsh Gupta, who is an investor and author. And as I've mentioned before, he's one of those people who can ground his views on economics in politics and culture. So, in many ways, he isn't your typical academic economist as such, but he's an economist nevertheless. So, Harsh believes that India is underleveraged on our debt, and that would be critical to our growth, and that we cannot, in his words, wait for people to buy things cash down to fuel this growth. So, welcome, Harsh. Nice to have you back.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you so much.
And on the other hand, we have probably one of India's best known tech entrepreneurs, Mr. Sridhar Vembu, who is co founder and CEO of Zoho, which offers a suite of online productivity software for businesses. Interestingly, Zoho hasn't raised a dime of funding, not 1 rupee, and quite unlike startups nowadays, and does about $500 million of revenue each year. Needless to say, Sridhar knows a thing or two about money, and quite naturally, Sridhar believes that we should focus on production instead, and the debt-fueled consumption mode of growth would be a recipe for disaster, as it has been in places like Greece and elsewhere. So, welcome, sir. Welcome to the show. It's an honor to host you.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, Kari.
So the one thing that both Harsh and Sridhar agree upon is that they're supremely optimistic about India's growth, and that that growth is rooted in our civilizational ethos. So I think I would like to start there. So Harsh, let's begin with you. I know you've spoken and written about this earlier on many different forums, that India could be a $12 trillion economy by 2030. But can you just briefly summarize why that is the case?
Thanks again, Kerry. Yes, by the way, extremely good introduction. I think the differences between me and Sridhar are not as pronounced as you made it out to be. But nonetheless, we'll find out as we go through this podcast. So why am I optimistic about India? Why have I written that we could be a $12 trillion economy by, say, end of calendar year 2030 or, say, fiscal year 2031? It is definitely a radically optimistic prediction compared to some international agencies who say more like $8 trillion. Mukesh Ambani has made a prediction of $10 trillion. So we are in the ballpark. I'm just slightly more optimistic, let's say. I think there are multiple reasons why we have to be very bullish. See, the last story is historically growth has been resource heavy and therefore resource constrained. And therefore, for a very dense populated country like India, that was a headwind. However, we are now seeing, thanks to various reasons, technology change, public policy response, and in general, the level of growth having reached a certain level, that our political economy is much more likely to see this headwind go away and other tailwinds come in. So what do I mean by that? So, I mean, first example, right? We've always been energy constrained in the modern era. Suddenly we find crude to be systematically lower price for a long time. We're finding technologies like renewable energies coming in, which are increasingly cost effective without subsidies, and indeed cost effective without subsidies, including storage. That last part is important because that means you don't need to have a coal or thermal backup for that solar or wind plant. And that completely changes India's energy imports and energy landscape because we have a lot of solar, wind, other forms of renewable energy. Similarly, what is growth? Growth in an Adam Smithian sense is when people in a village, in a city, in a country, in a world meet each other, are connected to each other, and exchange goods and services. And what we are seeing is a dramatic increase in connectivity in India, which I must say right now, a lot more needs to be done. But a village in Uttar Pradesh till 10 or 15 years ago was basically a local economy in the strictest sense of terms. Only very few things would get imported. But now you have Pakka roads, you have the internet, You have basic services being provided, which our friend Ashish, who calls, rightly said that OPEX looks like CAPEX. When you have sanitation and you have basic toilets and you have uh, now extremely important public health in the context of the pandemic we are going through right now. So in India, what we are seeing is social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure being laid out just as these trends become global and get accelerated. So, when you're starting at $2,000 per capita income and the world's leader is at $60,000 and more per capita income, there is only one way to go, and that's up. How much up and how fast we can debate that. So that's something that we need to broadly appreciate. And I think the reason why that didn't happen so far, the obvious question being, the answer there is it was a resource constraint, which immediately showed in a balance of trade, in a current account deficit, in the rupee depreciating beyond a certain manner. Those things will now be less and less problematic going forward. So that's a short answer. I'll pause at that.
Wow, 10 minutes into the podcast, we already have an Adam Smith reference, right? So, Harsh spoke about energy, infrastructure, and so on. Now, if you thought 12 trillion is ambitious, Sridhar has said before that we could be a $50 trillion economy someday. So, can you outline why you are bullish about India for our listeners, sir?
So let me first, the 10 trillion or 50 trillion, all of these are one side of this, and that is a macro way of looking at it. And I actually agree with Harsh. I'm very optimistic, bullish on India for some of the reasons he outlined, but I'm going to give you my separate, what I call micro reasons. He gave, I think, I would say macro reasons. But I'm going to, first, I disagree with him on the resource constraint issue, but I'll come to this. Why India has not grown so far, I would say, is not resource constraint so much as capability constraint. That means that it is not just our villages were isolated. They also had serious capability issues because of whatever our history. I mean, 1,000 years of certain history, as our literacy levels to our know-how, all of this has been eroded. And that is why we had such level of poverty that we found ourselves in post-independence, upon independence, right? And now we are slowly digging our way out of it. The capabilities are definitely growing. I see it at the rural level, where I'm in a village right now. And so this rising capability is what translates at the macro level to me as GDP. That is why I say that 10 trillion or long-term 50 trillion is actually quite possible. But at the same time, I actually don't obsess about GDP itself, because actually my criticism of modern economics is that it is obsessed with GDP to the detriment of actual well-being, collective overall well-being. And it's exactly similar to a company obsessing about only growth and revenue, forgetting the overall culture of the company, the employees' well-being and morale, all of those issues, which is very common in now a lot of private equity-driven companies where there is growth at all costs. And that's why I don't actually overemphasize GDP, even though I am very optimistic on the GDP front for India. And now the capability front, and you mentioned Harsh actually brought up trade deficit. That's a really good one. And I would say that today, in the last 15, 20 years of post-liberalization era, India has learned to consume. I am sitting in front of a MacBook Pro. I have an iPhone. I have an Android phone. I have all of these. But none of these actually India has the capability of producing. And this is true for a lot of the goods. Today, the scan machines, now we can actually identify the coronavirus through CAT scan machines, but all the machines are imported. And you can go on and on and on and on. So we have actually developed the capacity to consume without the commensurate capability to produce. That is what has held us back. And I would argue that if we had had the capacity to produce, our GDP already would have been 2-3x what it is today. That's the macro effect of that capacity at the micro level translating into GDP. So with that, I'll open the front for the next Salvona.
I'll just quickly respond, Carrie, if okay.
I just want to interject there.
Yes.
And say, so I think that leads to my next question as well. So which is that, Sridhar already spoke about, our discretionary incomes going up and, consumption going up. So why not, focus on production instead? Why do you think that it's necessary for us to buy things we cannot afford to kind of fuel this growth and spur this growth, right? And to what degree does numbers like GDP deficits and all of this matter to the common person?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's in a way where I was going. So I first of all I agree with Sridhar that the issue in India has been, to paraphrase it in a different way, that we were good at agriculture. We became good at certain high tech export services in a small elite of ours, and some of that income kind of percolated down to create some more blue collar services jobs. But what we missed was the middle, the basic manufacturing. And so in the opening statement, just for reasons of brevity, I had mentioned policy framework being converted from a headwind to a tailwind. And by that I meant is that we are now finding ourselves, besides the infrastructural points and besides the very important human capability, human capital points, if I can say that Sridhar mentioned, what we are now doing is we are finally getting the basic formula of manufacturing right. So we've gone back to what some economists call import substitution, in the sense that we have very moderate tariffs. We've kept the rupee somewhat lower by actually increasing our FX reserves very aggressively in the last year or so. And we've cut corporate taxes from 35 something to 25 something, including all the surcharges. So what this has meant, and along with the global geopolitical backdrop of the US-China trade war, which will almost certainly result in more protectionism after this pandemic ends, and once the short-term leverage of the Chinese with respect to some medical devices, etc., ends. So one of the reasons that I'm bullish, which I couldn't say in the first point, and which answers these 2 points, the consumption point and the Make in India point, is that we are finally giving our factory owners and industrialists, our small, medium entrepreneurs, a reason to switch to becoming manufacturers from importers. So a lot of the, from children's toys to Diwali fireworks to even Ganesh idols, all of this were being imported from Guangzhou or somewhere in Hubei or somewhere in China, and basically our businessmen were importers. So what we've done is something that we tried in the 1950s under Nehru, import substitution, and which is why it got a bad name. But the reason that did not work in the 1950s and 60s was, along with that, we did not have domestic free markets. So in the sense that we did not allow factory owners to do capex without waiting for 2-3 years of a bureaucratic permission in Delhi, because we had all the license quota raj. So the license was the issue, the problem, and not the import substitution. And because now we are doing a moderate version of that, we will manufacture going forward the kind of things that Sridhar mentioned. So I do not want us to per se consume what we cannot afford in an aggregate sense. But what I do want now, which brings us to the next point, what I do want is, see, if you have a certain trajectory as a nation, as an individual, or as a family, that you are going to earn more and more because of certain increments of human capital, financial capital, experience, and so on. So you think you'll have a higher and higher income going forward, and you cannot buy a car or a house, or more starkly, an education degree for your child, cash down, then would you rather make that investment? And is that good for the country? And would you not make that investment because you cannot sustain it without any debt? In that case, I do believe it is extremely important for us to have access to consumer finance debt, along with debt for infrastructure, roads, the kind of things that makes economic growth possible, along with factories. So imagine, the RBI cut 75 basis points of the repo yesterday. SBI instantly passed it along. It is the only bank to do it, but it's India's largest bank. And for a 1 crore 1 crore house loan, you pay 62,400 rupees less per year. Now, for somebody who earns, say, 10 lakh rupees a year, that is, and especially on a post-tax basis, that is 7, 8, 9% of his income increasing. And I don't think, if you look at a per square feet occupancy of Indians, like we consume 10 times less floor space area than Americans, for example. So America is the other extreme. India is the other extreme. So we do need more, maybe not necessarily 2 or 3 cars, but we do need homes, we do need factories, we do need education degrees. And, finance is how you borrow from the future. Finance is one way of redistributing to the poor without actually redistributing, in the sense that you allow them the access to buy resources but they still have to repay. So redistribution per se is separate. So the idea here is it has to be done in a way that the finance goes more towards investment than towards quote unquote conspicuous consumption. So that I'll agree on. So for example, on a Mercedes or a BMW, we have very high excise duties in India, right? Cars which are beyond certain 4 meters or whatever. Those kind of policies I actually agree with. We don't want to encourage through debt the consumption for the sake of consumption, but a lot of the debt actually goes into increasing the productive capacity and capabilities of our citizenry. That we have to make sure is very lubricated. I mean, I'll pause on that, and then depending on where it goes, I'll expand on that.
So, if I understood correctly, provide the capacity for people to, maybe start businesses or start things on their side, rather than consume and buying the second or third car or the second or third home, right? So, Sridhar,
to the extent, yes.
So what Harsh is essentially saying is, why not leverage the whole Indian middle class's aspirations? Because on a relative scale, there is so much room for growth, right?
Yeah, this is actually highly seductive. And this is an argument I'm actually afraid that a lot of the political class is going to fall for. So, but I must offer my counter to this. First, I want to point out in the Indian context, at least, and it's observed, you can observe it on the ground in the villages, where the debt is going is not for any kind of capital investment, even many times education. I'll come to the education part separately, but a lot of weddings, a lot of festivities, all of that. In fact, I know people who are actually who cannot rub a couple of nickels together, but they'll borrow 1 lakh, 2 lakh for a wedding. And now the easier financing options available actually have made these weddings more and more lavish, even in the rural areas. That I'm seeing that actually. So it is going into consumption, and this is not just true in India. I actually read about a story about Afghanistan where how weddings are bankrupting people actually. And then I thought, man, this is very surprisingly similar to what I've seen, that weddings bankrupting people. And I've actually also bailed out people who have been nearly bankrupted by weddings. The personal, I have that experience too. So in the Indian context, that is what a lot of debt is doing, because we have, and this is actually a broader point here. It takes us immediately to a broader point. That sociology of where the debt is going cannot be completely controlled top down. No matter how many policies you enact in Delhi or in the state capitals, you still have a certain local sociology at a village, at a community level. And that is going to dictate how the money is being put to use. And there are a lot of substitution effects. People may say that I'm using this money to build my shop, but in reality, they actually already had the money to build a shop. Now they're using this money to actually conduct a wedding. And this is happening a lot, actually. And this is why in a lot of these countries, and India is not the only one like this, and there is where the debt boom has coincided with the consumption boom, and China has been the willing vendor financier for this whole consumption boom for the world. So this has been an observed reality on the ground. So that's my first objection to this seductive vision that we could accelerate growth using debt. And the sad part is that all that growth actually looks like real growth. You see a consumption-oriented economist will see it and point to people's well-being is getting better. There's a lot more getting consumed. Therefore, we are enjoying growth. And that the GDP apparently is growing, because the reason is that even if we import the goods, there's a lot of local domestic value added in terms of all reseller, all of the servicer, all those jobs do get created. So we assume that there is actual growth happening on the ground, but it's an artifact of the way we measure this economic activity rather than any real growth. And this path directly leads to Greece. That has been my contention all along.
So Harsh, let's look at it in two different perspectives, right? So one is the whole macro policy-driven kind of way to modify this, and the other is, as Sridhar is saying, a micro societal entrepreneur-driven way of doing this, right? So let's talk about the macro policy bit for a while now. So what is it that you would do so that, people don't borrow for weddings or, cars and pants and stuff like that, rather than, rather borrow for businesses or education and stuff like that?
So again, excellent points there. Very good question. I agree with Sridhar. The point he used the word substitution effect. Basically, money is fungible, right? So yes, you can borrow. You can borrow. I'm saying for a shop or an MSME, but you actually have the cash and you end up conducting a lavish wedding for your daughter because of certain social pressures. The need to fit in, keep up with the Joneses, and you, in that sense, that money is still consumed. It does create jobs, but it does not create productive capacity increment for the country. So I think that critique is absolutely valid. So now the question is, what can we do? I think at the top level, again, Sridhar is right. Beyond a point, you can have these tax incentives and tweaks in Delhi and state capitals. I don't think beyond a point you can do much to that particular example. For example, beyond a point, I don't think you can do much from a government point of view on rural alcoholism, even though it is a very real problem for the men and especially the women of rural India. Gujarat has bans, Bihar has tried to ban it. It's actually kind of backfired, both on the finances and due to this kind of bootlegging crimes kicking in. So on the top down, the things that you can do is you can make, for example, business loans cheaper. For example, you can make sure that education loan, for example, gets a full tax benefit. You can expense more R&D for tax benefits. So these tweaks can be done. Some of them are already in place, but I don't think that I disagree with Sridhar that you can't fully change human nature. Where I disagree with him is that I don't think that it only goes to weddings. I think that is definitely one aspect of it. I think consumer finance debt in India as a percentage of GDP is around 10-11%. I haven't checked the number of late, so it could be wrong by a bit. And it seemed expensive in terms of interest payments to GDP because our real interest rates the last 3-4 years was quite high. But now that those are getting normalized again, we'll soon find out that interest rates, that debt to GDP in India is actually much lower than China or Greece or the US. So I think the question is not zero versus Greece. I think the question is there a happy optimum medium in the middle? And it might be the case that in this seductive vision, as Sridhar calls it, we try to go there, we will overshoot it. We'll almost certainly overshoot it. I agree with him. But the question is that still making it worth it versus not doing it? So it's not a question of very good alternative versus somewhat, it might be a bad alternative versus worse alternative. And my answer to that is we have to let those forces play out, because the way to understand is this. Right now, you have a demand-led growth and you have a supply-led growth. Right? You have demand-led reforms, supply-led reforms. In India right now, unlike the India of 2010, like a decade ago, we are not supply constrained anymore. In 2010, the slightest growth would lead to see the current account deficit booming, inflation booming. Remember those stories about the power blackouts, etc., etc. Right now, we have 100 gigawatts of extra power capacity. In sector after sector, our capacity utilization, even before this coronavirus thing, was around 70%. So right now, what does that mean? It means there is an automobile factory ready in Pune. There are people with skills ready to work, but they are not getting enough orders because we've artificially made getting a loan to buy a car difficult. So what Sridhar is saying is true to a large extent in a general universalist sense, but in a specific current Indian sense, our problem is demand-led right now for the next 3-4 years and not supply-led. It may so happen that after 3-4 years, supply does not keep up with demand and we get seduced into this debt thing and debt to GDP booms, and then we do have to curtail it. But if we do not do this right now, we will not even reach that position of that level of growth, per capita income and growth. So maybe my point is a bit more localized. But his broad point about these social issues, I fully agree. The sociology, I'm not, for example, in favor of banning conspicuous consumption in weddings. I think it's wrong. I think it is stupid. I think we have already banned things like dowry, etc. But I don't think bans will work. So he's absolutely right about the fungibility of money, and I don't think beyond a point we can do much about it.
So I have a more fundamental point here.
Can I,
Sridhar, just coming to you now. So why not spend on weddings, right? Because if it employs 100 people at the end of the day, right? And as Harsh mentioned, consumption also spurs demand after all. So why not let the forces play out? Let 100 people get ruined from borrowing for weddings or cars or whatever, so that the 101st and 102nd person is that much less likely, right? So this is going to even out. What do you think?
Yeah. This is the glorious path of Greece, right? And you have to remember, an economy. Greece is a ancient civilization. They have a lot to be proud of. I really admire that country. Okay, I read their philosophers. I admire that country. But look at the sorry state Greece is in today, and it has been there 5, 7 years. The last crisis was 2012, and there's still nothing has been resolved. So it's like a decades long crisis going on, and they are only matched by essentially sending their best and the brightest, the youth, majority of a lot of youth to Germany and UK and all of that. So unless we really want the children of India to be seeking opportunities abroad on a permanent basis, I don't believe that this path of debt leads us anywhere. And the reason is that you asked why not just live it up right now on a wedding. Well, first, that person was severely indebted, they go bust, and they are actually in India, going bust is hard over sociology. I mean, they may have borrowed from local money lenders, and it's a I see in this village where I'm sitting, there is a bunch of suicides because of these issues. That there is the shame of not being able to repay debt, and that people take their lives. So those kinds of issues come in. But more broadly, let me actually, in fact, I agree with Harsh on that we have to essentially borrow from the future to invest, because all investment is really intertemporal adjustment. We are anticipating something in the future and investing in the present time. That is absolutely correct. Really, where our disagreement is, do we want this to happen at a micro level, let's say at a firm level, at a district level, a village level, all of that, or at a macro level, at the country, that is India, doing this? So I would push this to happen, these imbalances, if you want to use that word, or rather intertemporal imbalances. As somebody you are investing in today, they will repay this tomorrow, kind of thing. That imbalance should be localized as much as possible. That is my primary push here. The imbalance is inevitable because obviously we invest in our children, and the children, then they grow up and then they produce themselves, and in some sense they are repaying the investment by taking care of their parents. The key question is, do we want to take that localized imbalance, intertemporal imbalance within a family, if you will, and make it a state level, macro level, country level imbalance? And this is actually this exact topic, children and parents. The Western world's answer is that the parents, beyond a point, don't owe anything to the children. The children absolutely owe nothing. Adult children owe nothing to their parents. The parents are supposed to collect social security or pension from the state, and the children are supposed to pay taxes to the state. So they have taken this imbalance, the intertemporal balance, completely, and moved it to the state level. And is this the path that we want to go down? That's a key question for India. And because I in fact, in one of my tweets, I mentioned it. This has real consequence to our being able to maintain our Dharmic civilization itself. Because if you cut off that intertemporal dependency within a family level, meaning children, parents, grandparents, all of that, we don't have much of a civilization left anymore. We are just, basically a pale imitation of the West, really, at that point. And we would be a failure doing that, actually, given our population density, all of that. So it is extremely important where these imbalances, or the intertemporal balances, I call it, lie. Are we going to put them at the Delhi level, or are we going to put at the family, farm, local, village level? That's the question.
Okay, so I think that's a fascinating set of points there. I have actually agree with a lot again, but I would say 3 points here: one minor and 2 major as keys for further discussion. So on the minor point is simply that I think, first of all, Greece is, I understand the example, but it is too small, and it had a fixed currency in the sense that it's it was part of the euro area, and therefore when bad times hit, it could not depreciate its currency like we are doing right now in a coronavirus situation. And as Nehru could not in the 1950s, it finally happened in the 1960s because it was seen as a prestige issue. And one of the reasons actually import substitution of 1950s became the license Raj of the 1960s and 70s was because we did not depreciate at the right time. And therefore, to minimize imports, because an overvalued currency means more imports and less exports, we had to then backward control through these licenses, and which had its own corrupt crony political stakeholders after that. So maybe Greece, I understand the broad point. Maybe Greece, because it had a fixed currency, could not depreciate it at the right time. It's not the right example. However, what I find fascinating, which Sridhar said, is where these intertemporal balances should lie, and that really got me thinking in 2-3 points which would support his thesis. And I would begin by saying this first. For example, if you do not have too much of a debt-fueled growth, and if you have better rental contracts, for example, not the kind of rent control silly contracts that we have from 1940s or 50s from the World War II times, but much more nuanced ones like which exist in Germany right now. Germany, the Berlin and the Frankfurts are the cities which are one of the few cities which do not have had that kind of real estate asset inflation the way Anglo-American cities have had. Is if you don't have that, then yes, maybe we don't need to borrow. Renting can become much more common, so long as you have certain protection for renters. That's number one. Number two, similarly, if you have college education through a better subsidized model, less professor unions, more online and digital things incorporated, you don't need very expensive education loans. So again, on that point, I agree with him. What I find interesting to the third point, which I think will open a much bigger point, is the state versus society balance that I think Sridhar has hinted at. Which is basically what he is saying is, okay, we need to borrow from the future. Should we borrow at the family level, individual level, state or central government level? And I think in different cases, it does make a difference. He is right into the sense that if you have a very individualistic, easy borrowing culture, perhaps along with a very strong welfare state that we are in the process of creating, then yes, the family structure weakens. In an extreme case, conservative authors, I admit, have, including African American ones, have written for the US that the African American society actually got significantly hurt by the 1960s Great Society programs of LBJ, because the extreme examples of that were you got money for becoming a single mom, and people just had more and more babies for that reason, without necessarily being married and so on and so forth. So we have to be very careful about what both consumerism as well as the welfare state, to be honest, in excesses in potential can mean for the family structure, which after all is the basis of any civilization and definitely our civilization, along with the broader social circles like a village or a community and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the point is, maybe that is too sanguine a view of certain current social developments, one of which, by the way, is this pressure of marrying off your daughter and spending a lot of money. So there's a lot of negativities attached with our certain interpretations and certain practices of our society and civilization as well. And having a more individualistic culture might mean people just having more weddings which are more business-like, just small friends and family gatherings. So I don't know what the right balance is, but I share the caution that Sridhar has hinted at. I do think the government, I'm perfectly fine with the government borrowing much more. Like, for example, building roads and stuff. I think the government does not borrow enough. States plus center, last 20 years, actually our debt to GDP has fallen from around 80-90% to 70%, and just the center has fallen to around 40% something of our GDP. That was mostly because our inflation was quite high. In the last 4-5 years, it hasn't fallen, it has been flat because the inflation fell before the rates fell, but it will start falling again. So long story short, we've never defaulted, unlike Brazil or Russia or many other African or Latin American economies. We actually have a lot of good debt capacity. Our bureaucrats and technocrats tend to be a bit too cautious. For example, the RBI is not doing a dollar sovereign bond. Euro sovereign bond is a no-brainer right now. Lock in almost 0% rates for 10-20 years for a small amount of money, just so that the corporates also have a yield curve. So maybe, yes, we should do it more at that level and have more things simple at the personal financial level so that we can avoid these extreme situations of suicides and stuff. I don't have an easy answer to that, but so while keeping the general caution of Sridhar in mind, I do think directionally right now we are underleveraged. I might actually agree with him, perhaps more than he agrees with himself 5 years from now. But right now, I think it's a different situation. That I'll pause at that.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're talking about is, where the intertemporal balances lie. And, obviously policy impacts things like this, right? So it's the whole guns versus butter kind of an argument. Now, I want to talk about how much of this is, right wing or left wing policies, right? So, is that even relevant in this whole argument at all? Recently, Claire Lehman, the founding editor of Quillette, said, "I'm usually a libertarian, but I'm not opposed to being a lot more socialistic in times of a crisis such as the one we're dealing with right now with the coronavirus," right? So, Sridhar, if I were to get you to switch places with Harsh instead and think of a more policy macro driven kind of a measure, what would you do to kind of have the sort of state that you would like?
It's excellent. Actually, that was what I was going to come to. I do agree that the state has to do certain things. I agree with it strongly. And for example, these are the two things that I would immediately do if I were the government. And a lot more investment in rural infrastructure, particularly roads and sanitation, and a lot more investment in rural broadband connectivity. In fact, I would like just like we have a Prime Minister's rural road scheme, I would like a Prime Minister's rural fiber optics scheme. Every village should have multiple gigabit connectivity. These two are critical along with sanitation and all of those priorities. And these are excellent investments for the state to be making, including by borrowing funds. And these are actually excellent to do right now because interest rates are low and it's very easy to borrow. And, or a different way of putting it, when we are going to do vendor financing, the vendors who are already in trouble right now will give us great deals now. So if you are going to import capital equipment for either telecom or for construction, all of that, we are going to get great deals if we do this right now. So the next couple of years, 3 years, actually I would unleash these things where the rural roads and connectivity, fiber and sanitation, all these projects can be accelerated further. That's where actually I would completely agree with Harsh that the state should be doing these things. Okay. And the attendant, there are multiplier effects. There are rural jobs because when you build roads, you have jobs. When you erect fiber, you have jobs, all of that. So these things, why, and this actually neatly dovetails with my own micro level priorities because this is where I come to rural development. That I believe, in fact, I'm myself in the process of creating these initiatives right now, additional rural initiatives. All these depend on this connectivity of both the physical connectivity roads and the cyber connectivity of broadband. This is very important for the future, the kind of jobs that I envision rural areas need. And it's also important for a kind of balanced, sustainable development I have in mind. For example, that even a person like me sitting here in this village, I don't consume a car. I mean, I don't drive much. I just take a bicycle. It's local roads and, it's like 2, 3, 4 kilometers easy. That is the kind of development we want. And it's like in Netherlands where everybody is on a bicycle all the time. That's what we need in India in our population density. And we can have a fairly high standard of living like the Dutch have while not taxing the environment that much. Because if a billion cars are on India's roads, I shudder to think what will happen to us. So all of these are important to interlink. So that's why I do believe that the government should borrow now for these things that I mentioned.
So Harsh, I'm sure you will agree with this as well, right? So spending on infrastructure and so on. But what are the other things that we could do to spur economic growth? You spoke about energy and so on. Can you cite some specific examples, that have worked elsewhere in other countries like US and China that we could kind of learn from?
Absolutely, yes. I fully agree with Sridhar's priorities in terms of public policy. Just before answering the question, I'll just briefly elaborate on that. But absolutely, if we have digital connectivity and road connectivity in rural areas, we might end up having, at some point, at least around the villages around big cities right now, more and more suburbanization, exurbanization, and more white-collar jobs going there, which in turn has a multiplier effect of blue-collar jobs. I mean, we all three of us are have basic awareness, I would say, about tech trends. I'm sure Sridhar might know a bit less than us. I'm just kidding. Is that there's something called Microsoft HoloLens, which is version 3 is about to come in 2022 or 2023. 5G is about to come. Augmented reality is coming. These are not any more sci-fi things. So imagine somebody in Sridhar's village, or even Sridhar himself, doing almost a Star Trek kind of conference call with his executives or his friends or whoever he wants to talk to, and being as productive as he can be in that village as he is in New York or San Francisco or Bangalore. And imagine, I can teach a class of students in a university. Yeah, I can teach a class of students in a university across the world because of this connection and live at 1/20th the cost. So I fully agree with him strongly that given the density of India, given examples like Netherlands and Belgium that he hinted at, we do need this kind of growth model so that we can also, maybe have one car for a family, but the second means of travel could be a sharing thing like Ola, Uber, or a cycle or a two-wheeler. So I agree with that. What else can we do? I think we really need to focus on the human capital side of things, which other countries have done much better than us. I think so far it has not been a constraint for us, simply because of the large population that we have had and a relatively thin elite. So, good way to quantify that is the entry level salary for a TCS, Infosys, Wipro kind of person for 15 years was in the 3 to 4 lakh range, right? Despite inflation, etc. So that means there was a very good supply side response on the higher education side. But I think for further growth, we need more quality education both in the schooling and university level, and I think that is not happening. The access has happened, quantity has happened, but for quality we need to understand how we deal with public unions in general to rationalize the state expenditure and how we incorporate technology, ed tech, finance, fintech, other governance technology. So I think that is something that we really, really need to work on. But the biggest thing we can do is good old solid physical infrastructure, because for manufacturing, for logistics, for exports, for everything, if we just do that, our people are already productive enough.
Yeah. So, Sridhar, one of the things I would be remiss to not ask you about is entrepreneurship itself as a driver for growth. Now, we've seen plenty of people start up, and it become, I won't say it's a fashion, but I would say that, the trend is that, hey, I mean, between a B school or a startup, or between, joining an investment bank or a startup, the startup seems to hold up its end fairly well over the last few years, 5 to 10 years, I would say, the post Flipkart era. So how do you think about that? What can we do to encourage entrepreneurship? Are we on the right track with that?
There's 2 points that I want to address, particularly as it pertains to this rural development. Having the infrastructure done, which is, I consider, state responsibility, and state should do it even by borrowing. But there is a thing that something additional that has to happen at the microeconomic level for this to actually bear fruition in terms of development objectives. That is, of course, entrepreneurship at the local level. And I'm going to actually capture this not in the Bangalore sense of the startup, but in a broader theme of self-reliance or self-sufficiency. And for example, this is a lecture I gave to our agricultural workers here. Seriously, I did that. I assembled 100 of them. They had about maybe 40 bikes among them. And I pointed out, how many of us in this village know how to build this bike? Zero. How many of us know how to build a refrigerator that is in your homes? How many of us know how to build a gas stove? How many of us, of course, know how to build a smartphone? Zero, 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 right? And I said, that is poverty. We want all these goods. We even have access to these goods, but we don't know how to make these goods. And as long as we stay that way in this village, we are going to be poor. And we are going to have to depend on either debt or government handout to pay for all this. There's no other option. Either we have to go into debt or the government is giving us free stuff. So this is the reality. And this comes to education. I actually, in fact, I'm strongly opposed to the current, even K-12 fashion, even in the US. I've actually moved on to homeschooling and a lot of that, because the fundamental purpose of education to me is to create a self-reliant citizen. And we are not doing that right now. And worldwide, this is true in the US and this is true in India. And we are actually creating highly dependent people who, even at small scale, at a family level, at a community level, cannot take care of themselves right now. And what do I mean by that? For example, I would say that you take a group of 10 students, 20 students from a typical school, how many of them can fix their own toilets at home, their own plumbing, their own basic stove and all of these things, their own bikes? Most people cannot now. And yet They can write exams on when Babur invaded India and when how many minerals are there in Australia. That's what we study in school, which is completely useless because we forget that. I don't
Great
think
point.
any of us can actually tell us which year Babur invaded India. I don't remember now, honestly, right? But we of course studied it, right? We wrote exams. I even did well in those exams, and that's useless. So that is why I say that. On the other hand, I actually wish that at that time I learned, for example, how to take temperature. Right now, that's a very valuable skill. How to take blood pressure of somebody, and how to, maybe even give an injection. All of those things in this village level, these are critical skills right now because the nearest doctor is about 8 kilometers away. And these are the things that self-reliance means. That's what I would put the focus on in education. And once you have that attitude of self-reliance, that mental attitude, then you get entrepreneurship as an add-on from there. Okay, that we have the ability to we look at possible hacks to fix our own problems. Okay, we just find creative solutions, and that is the jugaad, but that is also a hack, and that is how true startups come to me. Not because there is VC investment. The problem I have with the Indian startup ecosystem is it's all too VC driven right now. And in fact, often a lot of entrepreneurs I meet, their whole purpose seems to be raising money. Okay, and then that kind of puts the whole, the priorities seem different. But I actually want to start with self-reliance, and I want to start with education for self-reliance. Then I want to say our diverse needs, how we meet. So that's why I actually define capital as the ability of a people to take care of their own diverse material needs. That's what I define capital as. And in that sense, we need to build capitalism from the grassroots. And the state investment is necessary. The infrastructure is necessary. Sanitation is necessary. But at the same time, we have to have that education that is correct, which actually builds that self-reliance. Then from there, we start building. And I actually mentioned to people, how many of us have thought about hacking together an electric bicycle? Don't think about electric motorcycle. Take a bicycle and attach a motor. How many of us have thought about it? Why not? I ask. And we have 100 youth here, and some of them have even polytechnic diplomas, but actually they are jobless. I said that is how it should start, and don't worry about investment. Don't worry about all of that. I have spare time. I'm going to hack things together. And if we have that, and I know there are welders here who are mostly jobless. Okay, they know how to weld. Why don't we weld something to a bicycle and see what happens locally? It's not going to kill us because the speeds are low and it's a countryside. So that is the hacking mindset that I want to develop here. And from there, that is the route from which all of prosperity actually comes to me. So that's the micro level view of this. And that's where I want to focus. As a country, we should actually encourage this.
That's a fantastic point. Entrepreneurship is a byproduct of self-reliance, as Sridhar says. So you solve for yourself, and then you think you can solve for a wider community, and you can exchange that value for capital, right? So Sridhar famously stays in Tenkasi in Tamil Nadu. As we are talking to him, we could hear birds chirping in the background, and he leads by many accounts an ascetic life, worrying more about farm produce than wait times on his Uber or Ola. While Harsh lives in Kolkata, which is sort of a metro, I guess, right, Harsh?
Yes, sort of right now.
and he's been an active proponent of urbanization and believes that India's growth will be spurred by cities rather than villages. So Harsh, why is it necessary for rural Indians to urbanize? Can they modernize irrespective of that?
Okay, so I think urbanization, yes, but by urbanization I do not mean that people who are right now living in villages have to go into what are now cities. In fact, I think that will be quite detrimental in the Indian context, given our cities are already overstaffed, clearly overburdened. So what I mean by urbanization, I'll start with a very visual image. If you think of Kerala, if you think of large parts of Tamil Nadu, and if you think of large parts of Eastern UP and Bihar, these are places with more than 1,000 people per square kilometer. These are people where villages are often more than 5,000 people, large villages. And for our statistical census reasons of 75% have to be agricultural workers and the males have to be this and that, for various reasons where we have one of the world's strictest definition of urbanization, especially in UP and Bihar, they are not classified as urban. So I don't want these people to go into a city. I want, following Sridhar's point of view, that okay, you have these pakka roads, and then you have broader pakka roads, and then you have basic internet, and then you have broadband internet. I want the larger villages to become towns. In that sense, urbanization is very important, because urbanization simply means larger division of labor, larger division of labor specialization, leading to higher productivity, which seems a bit in dissonance with what Sridhar said in terms of being self-reliant, but it's not necessarily so, because his point was more on education. Our education needs to be more hands-on, and there is very much a sense in India that if you don't have a white collar job, you are not somehow, you're not doing a prestigious thing of sorts, right? So that's a separate thing. But any economic growth obviously has to happen through specialization, which in turn happens through urbanization. But that urbanization need not be in existing cities. It could be in larger villages, kind of organically congregating to become urban areas, new urban areas, especially in the Gangetic Valley. In fact, large parts of the south, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and other places in the north like Haryana, the villages, the large villages are already de facto towns. The place where it has to happen properly is UP and Bihar, but what needs to happen everywhere, and we've talked about this separately in another podcast before, is that the urban governance needs to be extended to these so-called panchayats. Because they want some government handouts, which technically goes to quote-unquote rural areas. So there is a bad incentive for them to not reclassify themselves, and they kind of get stuck in a certain poverty paradox. But besides that governance issue, many of them are already de facto towns. They just need better and better infrastructure like sanitation, cleanliness, and so on and so forth. Better local governance with some ability to raise local taxation as well, which is missing in our villages. So I'm for urbanization, but not in the sense that it might come across as.
Okay. So Sridhar, my question is, how can villages become self-sustaining? You spoke about, self-reliance and so on earlier. How can these villages become self-sustaining? We're seeing that, tier two, tier three cities and towns today are more modern than before. You have an Amazon or an Uber, Ola operating in these places. So there is clearly access to products and services. And it's not, it's not as inevitable as it was earlier that, people will just move to the cities for a better life. So how do you think we can kind of continue this trend and make villages themselves self-sustaining?
First of all, I actually completely agree with Harsh. We, even in this region, which looks very spacious and all that, population density is more than 500, 600 people per square kilometer, and Kerala as a whole is more than 1,000 people per square kilometer, or UP and Bihar, all of that. And so by any Western standard or any other country standard, these are already actually kind of ex-urban neighborhoods rather than villages. We just classify them differently, but the population is there. But I often joke that you take a random point in India, put a random dot on the map, draw a 30, 40, 50 kilometer radius, which would be a district. You are going to find a couple of million people easily, okay? A lot more, but at least 2 million. And that's not the definition of a very sparsely populated area by any stretch. So you do have people everywhere. That goes without saying. And now coming to this whole self-reliance model, I'm actually counting on a particular technology here. So let me illustrate this. I actually believe, and a lot of evidence supports me, that the economies of scale needed for achieving production unit costs would drop substantially for everyone to afford something. There's economies of scale are kicking in at smaller and smaller scales. It's a very critical point, so I'll reiterate. So if only at 1 million cars a year a factory is, can achieve world-class cost structure, today I think latest technology you can do this at maybe 50,000 cars per year or 30,000 cars per year. Only at 1 million cars a year, today I think the economies of scale that are needed to achieve that cost efficiency is still coming down. The scale at which to achieve those cost efficiencies. Or if you see the S curve is saturating at smaller scales. That's what I would visualize it as. And this is true in lots of industries. It's not just true in, it's true in manufacturing, all of that. the implication of that is very crucial for rural, smaller scale self-reliance, because this means that you can actually distribute production to of that is very crucial, because this means that at level, or at least each district level, and definitely in many products at local village level, where a cluster of villages, each village specializing in some category of goods and trade with each other to satisfy their own needs. You don't need gigantic scale. You don't have to intergalactically export all your production in order to achieve prosperity. You do have that local level. So this is the first technological trend that I actually am very enthusiastic about, that where scale economics, where it kicks in. And the second is, and this is actually physics, all the way to particle physics we go to now, we are almost reaching the edge of the knowable in field after field after field. There's actually a book written called Lost in Math in particle physics by a German physicist. She writes, and she got a PhD about the same time I did, which is about early 90s. She says in her 30-year career now, they've come up with a gray hole after gray hole after gray hole. It's really, really, really hard to beat the standard model in quantum mechanics or the theory of relativity, and there is not all the unified field theory, all of that, or the string theory, all of that have failed to come up with anything new physics. And it's actually at this point in a lot of these fields, it's becoming kind of an intellectual crisis. And this is true, drug discovery, it's true. A lot of, it's very hard for new medicines to beat the placebo effect now. That's why it's getting harder and harder. That's why they're becoming more expensive, because whatever you come up with, it doesn't actually beat the placebo. No, that's a well-known thing. There is a Wikipedia article on this subject. So this is true for a lot of fields now, where and you can see this in the commonplace observation that what was the last time a major efficiency gain was made in the internal combustion engine? And even our computers have started becoming faster and faster. Moore's law has actually plateaued. That your 5-year-old computer is quite serviceable now, and this is arriving rapidly to smartphones too soon. That you're not going to have tenfold improvement in your speed or whatever in the next 3 years. It's not happening. So these are trends that ironically has actually an implication for rural areas, because that means that you are. And I say this to engineers this way: it is always easy to catch up to a not moving target. If a target is moving fast, it's harder and harder. It's hard to catch up. But if the target is not moving, it's actually easier to catch up. And this means that you can actually build know-how in rural areas and catch up with the reasonably latest technology standard in an area quicker. And that reasonably latest technology standard itself is not moving ahead very fast. Okay. So that means that you can actually localize production more and more in a district level or a village level, and this is very important for India, because we really cannot afford to take 500-600 million people and put them in these cities already overburdened, impossibly overpopulated cities. So we have to keep people where they are, and we have to build good infrastructure there, good quality of life there where we are, and at the same time achieve these production economies, all of that at the local level. So I'm optimistic because I believe all of these things are coming together, and that's why I think that it's actually possible to do it.
Great points. So Harsh, Sridhar believes, and he lightly touched upon this in his answer earlier as well, that there is no such thing as an exponential growth, right? Unsustainable exponential growth, and that it is kind of finite. You want to add to that? I mean, maybe talk about it from your perspective as well.
I mean, that's a fascinating point, and there are multiple views on that. It's true that the Moore's law and other kind of these semiconductor laws have not played out that way in the last few years, and we're kind of at the edge of it, materially possible. On the other hand, this is an old kind of there is prosperity non-stop versus a neo-Malthusian view, and I'm not saying Sridhar is a neo-Malthusian at all. He's clearly optimistic, and the truth is probably in the middle. But it really depends how you see it. So on one extent, yes, there are limits in a particular technology. On the other hand, a certain other technology opens up. For example, I do think that a world with nearly infinite and nearly cheap energy, which I'm not sure whether Sridhar agrees with that or not, but I do think it's coming in the next 10, 15, 20 years, will mean dramatically different things in ways that we cannot imagine right now. For example, Chennai recently, in the last few years, had a water shortage. Bangalore is also a very water-starved issue, although Bangalore is not on the coast. And Chennai responded with, basically distillation and desalination, from the Bay of Bengal. The problem with desalination historically has been it has been very energy intensive. Now, the moment you change the equation with the cost of energy, both in a financial sense as well as in an environmental impact sense, the calculus for desalination across the world, and a lot of the population of the world still lives along coasts or along riverbeds, changes completely. I mean, so far, the people who were doing it very aggressively were the Gulf states. They had a lot of money and they had relatively small population, and for obvious reasons, water was important there. But now it's happening much faster. So I think different areas will see different levels of jump. Um, I don't know whether the exponential growth to that extent is possible. It is fascinating what Sridhar said about the placebo effect, and his implicit point being that to create new commercially viable R&D, and therefore to have that incremental growth by tinkering, it is becoming more and more difficult because a lot of these fields seem to kind of plateau a bit. On the other hand, the argument is that there are so many more scientists and engineers who are at it, that while it is harder to move the needle, a lot more people are pushing it. You basically have China, the ex-Soviet Union, India opening up in the last 2 decades, whereas the number of active, well-funded scientists and engineers earlier were much, much lower, say till 20, 30 years ago. This is the Julian Simon versus neo-Malthusian kind of view. Like Julian Simon famously had a bet, I'm forgetting the name of the other gentleman, in 1980, saying that the price of any five natural resources, materials, commodities you choose will be cheaper in 1990. And he won that bet. Now, that might just have been that particular decade, but if you see something like all the natural inflation adjusted, their prices are flat or lower over 100 years. And if you see it as a percentage of incomes, they are much, much, much lower. So I'm not sure that we live in, I think Sridhar initially said he disagrees on the resource constraint part, so maybe there is a nuance there. But I'm not sure that we have seen the end of exponential growth per se, but I fully agree that a lot of the production will be localized. Maybe there'll be economies of scale on the knowledge side, on the ideas side, but not on the goods side. I mean, the extreme example of that is 3D printing, right? That is still some distance away, but if you could have something which is sent through the broadband, this intellectual property, or make something, once you have that in your local village 3D printer, you're just printing it there. And therefore, from that village point of view, there are no economies of scale. You have interconnected but still somewhat self-reliant village economies, which reduces the threat of these things like plagues and pandemics whenever it happens next, because you don't need those logistical supply chains. So I think there are a lot of opposing forces here. There are less economies of scale, but there are more economies of scale on the knowledge side. And on the knowledge side, whether it's exponential or linear, that is unclear right now. But I agree, just one final point I'll say, I'll agree with him that entrepreneurship is very important. And one thing very boringly, simply, that the Indian state can do is make it much easier to open a simple company. Something they're trying, but they're still struggling with. You don't need 1 lakh rupees or whatever paid up capital. Make it very, very, very simple. And actually, Bangalore, the whole Indian Silicon Valley, so-called tech ecosystem, companies like Zoho can make it much easier. But if I am a small entrepreneur, I can just have a simple, smaller version of this is my accounts I need to do. And I am also therefore liable to get cash flow based loans from a local bank because I'm no longer in the unorganized sector, even though I'm just selling chips and Pepsi in a village outlet. So can that happen in a very simple, easy to access format? That will really democratize entrepreneurship in India.
Yeah, I think that's something that all of us can agree on. Sridhar, would you like to add to that? Because I have another question otherwise.
Yeah, actually, there is some couple of things about energy. Even at zero cost energy, infinite potential supply, the whole sun is available to us. There are physical limits because we cannot let the entropy of this planet go out of control. So there is physics arguments on why we don't want to consume the energy even if it's available. That's actually, and we are not that far from it, because even solar energy, and that could have ecological impact. If there's not, we cannot assume that even that's available infinite. But these are not, actually, I'm not worried about it, because I'm not actually also seen in one critical reason that our population demographics is already in control. And I see this obviously where I am sitting right now in the village. In fact, I had a conversation with a worker. He said, hey, we stopped having kids. So many people now have one kid or two kids. So the average in Tamil Nadu itself is now 1.7 or 1.6 right now. The fertility rate for the number of kids per woman. And it's dropping. It's dropping like a stone. In fact, one of the big industries now is fertility centers now. So demographics is not a problem. And without demographic explosion, you're not going to have a Malthusian problem. So we have enough to go around, because we just have fewer mouths to feed. So that is not actually a problem. But I still think that, and this is where my spiritual part of the spiritual economics kicks in. We really cannot keep emphasizing material production and consumption alone as the determinant of well-being. That's a very critical point, because that's a very Western economist worldview. There is a point at which people stop caring about that additional unit of consumption. It happens to everyone, even in the West, and I hope it actually happens at a smaller scale in India too. And we should not care about having that next car, this all the material goods, because it's also not just caring about the planet, all of that, and we should not. It's also not a soul. It is our psychic lack of, what do you call that? What is the right word? That's inner satisfaction, or actually about the mindset of enough. Okay, and that is important, because I think we cannot just have economics detached from the overall well-being of a person, and that means that energy consumption to material goods to all of these have to be in balance. And I actually am an optimist that they are coming into balance. People are sensible, even at, and I don't believe that we are going to have reckless consumption in India ever, partly because of our spiritual traditions. There is that attitude of enough. And so that is important. And if we achieve that, then we can have actually, anybody who has a mindset, I want to consume a lot more, they have the room, but most people are not interested in it. And the pecking order based on only consumption goes down. That I don't need to impress my villagers by having 3 Benz cars parked there in my farm. And that is important. That is how I believe that India should grow and achieve a developed country status, not because we consume world class, but because we actually are, we have educated citizens, people who are self-reliant, people who are tolerant, all of that, and we have enough to go around, and we have the attitude of enough. So that is my vision for India.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with that, right? And for another reason as well, because we're seeing examples of that in the West. The whole consumption-driven culture is coming full circle right now. So you have minimalism, you have spirituality, and a real focus on the inside as much as as it was about material growth and material consumption earlier. So I have a question on this, but we'll get to that. I was just curious about what you guys make of the modern monetary theory, which is you can't get through an economic discussion these days without someone bringing this up, right? So the basis that value is infinite, so capital is pegged to value, and money is a form of capital. So why don't we produce money endlessly to solve all kind of necessities, whether it's healthcare or housing or whatever it is, and you have a central regulatory authority of some kind that can regulate this constraint, create a supply constraint like any other resource, and we should all be fine, right? Harsh, what do you think about that?
Hi, Kerry. Yes, I think that's a fascinating question. What I would say is, modern monetary theory is not really properly understood or defined even right now. You can't just print money non-stop, right? There is a constraint of inflation. So the modern monetary theory
works in a certain context when you have a lot of spare supply side capacity and you hopefully use what you print more for stuff that ends up being productive in the long run, for example, rural infrastructure again. So while some people like politicians in the US on the left, like Alexandria Cortez, she says basically let's just print money and give everybody free full education, healthcare, and then universal basic income and so on and so forth. I don't think it works like that. Let us remember, at least in India's case, we've come down from double-digit kind of inflation every now and then just 4 or 5 years ago. So the very reason why even yesterday or day before yesterday, the RBI could announce these open market operations, these targeted LTROs, long-term repo operations. The reason why we can pump a lot of money is because that basic inflation, core inflation is under control, and we have a lot of spare capacity in place. So, MMT is not magic. It is just that the world saw this entry of China into the supply chains, massively doubled up capacity over 20 years for the whole world. And then therefore, inflation is low. There are demographic reasons for that in the West in terms of saving and consuming and people getting older. But MMT, I would see it with a lot of caution. But right now, yes, what the Fed is doing in terms of trying to stop a financial collapse, I understand that. But then the argument is, which I'm, people like Sridhar would say, and I have a lot of sympathy for, is it's kind of one of the things where you fight the urgent, but then you lose on the important, right? So you do what you have to do in the short term. But right now, for example, the US seems Japanified for sure, because now it seems very unlikely that they can ever raise interest rates very high, because if their debt goes to, it's probably already crossed 100% of GDP. The Japanese are somewhere at 200% of GDP. If your debt is at 200% of GDP and if your interest rates go high, your debt payment, your interest payments become a very large part of your GDP, which is simply not possible. So you're on this running mill, and you have to run faster and faster. So at some point, when you do not have the fundamental underlying capacity, that is when disaster strikes. So far, it has not struck anywhere. In last major economy that fell to that was Germany between the two wars, the Weimar Republic inflation, which in a way led to Hitler, right? So it is something to be let us not get very happy about free money. It may be required to be done right now, but ultimately there is no free lunch. That basic law of economics or physics or whatever does not go away. So that's how I would address it.
Yeah. So Sridhar, would you like to add to that, or I can ask you another question on the civilizational ethos?
I'll just add one note on MMT. This is based on the idea that you can print, the government can abolish, just do spending based on printing, and if inflation goes a little bit out of control, tax. So the two policies of printing and taxing can actually keep things in balance. That's the idea. That is the intellectual premise of this. And they will point to mostly the economies have worked that way because you do have a lot of printing going on. The monetary base have exploded in all these countries, and you do have taxes. So the tax is automatically doing regulation on overspending. If inflation goes out of control, you tax more. That's been the idea. But I do believe that there's two things that these MMT proponents ignore. One, Harsh already mentioned, the vendor financing from China propped up everybody. When you have a source of essentially seemingly infinite spare capacity at very low prices available, you can get to run any kind of policy because the other guy is subsidizing your goods. It doesn't matter what you run inside because China is the vendor financier for everybody, for US, for India, everyone. So that is one thing and I believe that will go away. Both Chinese demographics and all the trade friction, all of that. That's the first thing. The second is you do have second order effects from all these policies that over time it reorders the sociology, which we talked about in the beginning, and that has very detrimental consequences to long-term productive capacity of citizenry. In fact, this is very important right now in this pandemic response. And Harsh mentioned it in his tweets. Isn't that interesting that India, which all of us actually will dump on India often with, we have broken this and that, we have handled it so much better than the US. which has vastly superior capability on paper, and yet India has actually handled it better so far. And why is that? And I would argue that all these policies have eroded capacity at all levels in America. At the state level, the government level, at the federal level, state level, and even at corporate level, because corporate CEOs have been obsessed about balance sheets and about profit and loss all the time, and cash flow and stock buybacks. They've lost the governance capacity, I would argue. And this is a loss at a whole country level, and that's what we are witnessing that failure of in the pandemic right now. So these are the second order consequences of MMT that mathematical models cannot capture. So with that, that's my take on MMT. So now you want to ask a question?
Yeah. So Sridhar, you mentioned our handling of the current crisis, and one of the things that someone tweeted recently is that India lives in chaos. Usually, right? We're comfortable with chaos, and so in times of actual chaos, we fall into order, right? So that seems to be like a uniquely Indian or a Dharmic perspective. This comfort with plurality that we have, right? And I'm sure it's something that the both of you agree on. Sridhar, I want to ask you about that specifically. How can we leverage that Dharmic ethos as social equity to kind of breed and spur prosperity in India?
That's a very important point, and this is where I talked about the local level intertemporal balance. It's a very technical term, but what I mean is that at a family level, we need to take care of the old and the young. We cannot outsource that to the state. At a village level, we have to take care of the sick and the disabled. At the district level, we have to take care of things. We cannot, at the corporate level, companies have, what in India we have this term corporate social responsibility. I actually do take it very seriously because that is the Dharmic perspective. As an example, right now during this pandemic, we have decided to pay all our contract staff, the drivers, the housekeepers, all of that. We continue to pay them because we actually know if we let them go at this time, what will they do? It makes no sense, right? That is the Dharmic perspective. And we don't want to kind of throw them at the mercies of the state. We are responsible for our own. And there's another example of that. We are actually building a multiple, some 20-30 bed emergency healthcare facility in our premise, assuming that we are going to hit by the virus. We have not been hit, but I actually like to make a worst case assumption. We have built that out simply because I know that the state needs that augmented capacity. That we cannot all put our problems to the state and the central government. It's not actually Prime Minister's problem or the Chief Minister's problem. I also have my share of that problem, and I would take care of it at least at our company level, maybe at our neighborhood level. So that is, to me, a Dharmic perspective, really. That we are all in this together, and my actions have ramifications for everyone around me and on the whole universe. So therefore, it is not just my wealth; it is also that how my overall village, my neighborhood, my employees, all of them do. That has a direct effect on my well-being. That perspective is very important for us to keep in terms of the policymakers. And my fear is that there is a fascination with these Western models, the Western-trained academic economists. They come in and with their equations and they, purport to teach us how to do this, but they completely forget this perspective. And this is one of the reasons why I want to build out a school of economics almost, because see, part of it is our low self-esteem. We think that they bring some specialized superior knowledge. And I say bullshit. They don't actually bring any specialized superior knowledge. So I want to build out a school that actually counters them at the level at which intellectually that needs to be countered. Even mathematically it needs to be countered. I actually have a math PhD, so I actually know their math is mostly bullshit math. There's not a lot of depth in it. So I actually want to counter it at that level because that is important now for our survival of our civilization itself. Long term.
Fascinating stuff. So Harsh, I'm sure you agree with all of what Sridhar said. Would you like to come in and add what are the 2 or 3 uniquely Indian qualities, Dharmic qualities that will spur our prosperity?
No, I fully agree with everything Sridhar said. Especially the point about low self-esteem is basically the sum all of the reason why we end up listening to people who are probably well-intentioned, no doubt about it, but who are speaking completely out of context. even if many of them happen to have been born in India. But if they are living in, working and studying abroad, with some few noble exceptions, that context overrides their thinking, perhaps subconsciously. And we think that अच्छा कोई New York या London से आया है, तो फिर obviously that person therefore will have a better knowledge base. So that, I think it's part of the post-colonial change, gradual change in our mindset. So that's one. I think the one thing that we need to understand is what happened under, not to make it very political, but very, very broadly, in Nehruvian India. Famously he said to J.R.D. Tata that, profit is a dirty word, Jawaharlal Nehru, our first prime minister. So I think our civilization fully understands the value and the worth of creating wealth, of creating earth, and that being a very important aspect of Purusharth, like that of a man or a human being's life. It also sees inherently the importance of considering that wealth in a trusteeship format, right? You can say Gandhiji mentioned about, the trusteeship model, but this actually goes much earlier. You can talk to Jains in Rajasthan and Gujarat. You can talk to the so-called trading castes from North India or South India, and they've always the responsibility of using that wealth for the religion, for civilization, for society at large was always taken very seriously. And our temples themselves, this is what Sanjeev Sanyal often writes, were basically like venture capitalists, especially the coastal temples in Tamil Nadu. They were in a way financing, ensuring trade with Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. So there was a certain ecosystem where the spiritual and the financial and the economic were all interlinked. And what happens is when you break certain parts and you assume that now we can continue as usual, and then you follow a certain different kind of worldview, you basically have interconnected parts which are just not getting along anymore. So there's a lot of jarring effect, so to speak. I think we are in that transition phase right now. And I think if somebody like Sridhar starts a new Indic or Dharmic school or Indian context school of economics and public policy, political economy, grounded in both mathematics as well as the cultural context, I think that will be of great intellectual use to the country going forward, because somebody has to do that going forward. There has to be some understanding of our unique historical background, which does not, I don't mean to say that there are some basic, let's say, patterns. Let's not use the word rules, but some patterns do show up again and again. So I'm not saying that we cannot learn anything from other countries. This should not be seen as intellectual chauvinism, but there is something nonetheless to be said about first knowing your own intellectual and cultural context. So I'll just leave it at that.
Wow, that's a really profound and fascinating note to kind of end this podcast. Now, before we leave, I'm going to ask both of you, what is it that you're reading right now, and what would you recommend to our listeners? So we'll start with Sridhar. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, actually, I've been reading about architecture, primarily because we are building a lot. And one of the topics that this is totally different topic, is how did the world build such a shoddy, such a bad stuff in the 20th century? And it turns out that other people have observed it and written books on this topic. So I'm reading this book by an architectural historian called James Curl, I believe, it's professor, and he talks about how architectural barbarism in the West, and which we have, of course, imported in India too. This whole Bauhaus school from Germany, that and basically a Marxist architecture school that inflicted itself on the whole world. So that's something that I've been reading about, partly because I actually want to revive some of our own architectural traditions of India too, which are, and this is important because it's actually connected. I want people to live and work in surroundings that also are uplifting to the soul. Okay, there's something about if you go to a Hindu temple, there is some effect it has. Particularly if you go, we are surrounded by these in the south. There is something that happens. You don't have to be actually a believer, but you know that there's something happening, right? And that is architecture. So that is important to revive these traditions in India. That's something, that's why I've been reading this book lately.
Yeah, it sounds really fascinating. I mean, so I'm a fan of Taleb, and he as well says right about localism and how we're just importing architectural styles from elsewhere and like ruining the local ethos and aesthetic as such. Harsh, what are you reading, and what would you recommend to our listeners?
Oh, I've just finished reading two books. So I'm not reading anything right now. I just finished reading two books the last 2 weeks. One is State Economy and the Great Divergence, which is an economic history comparison between the UK and China. And how the long and short of that book is, it's a very, very complicated book. Dr. Anant Nageshwaran recommended it to me, Dr. V. Anant Nageshwaran. And it's basically is that the British had a state in the very competitive European state system of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, which led to mercantilism, imperialism, and financialism that led them to beat China. So that's the thesis of the book. The other book that I finished reading is India Unlimited by Dr. Arvind Panagaria. So that's also a very fascinating book. He's written many books about the Indian economy before. Very, very practical recommendations about market and other reforms going forward. I disagree with him a bit on the trade policy side, but nonetheless, it's a very good documentation of the issues. And I've just started reading, which I've not read completely yet, The New Silk Roads. It was by an author who's written a lot about the Eurasian continent, and he had an earlier book 5 years ago about Silk Roads and how the history of India, China, and Central Asia. So there's a lot of time to read right now. So that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, interesting times being quarantined. For what it's worth, for what it's worth, I'm reading volume 1 of the Mahabharat. It's a translation by Vivek Debroy that I'm reading right now, and it's one of a long-pending bucket list item of revisiting some of our classics. I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour or so, but I'm afraid we've come to the end of what is perhaps the most fascinating episode we've had thus far. It's been, really, it's been an enlightening experience to listen to both Sridhar and Harsh coming at it from different ends. But, as they say, largely agreeing with everything important, right? I certainly learned a ton of things, and I'm sure that you would have found this insightful as well. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. This was the first in a series of podcasts where we get people with slightly differing views to debate things in a reasonable manner, away from all of the Twitter, WhatsApp nonsense that usually ensues. Right. So if you know of people that we should host, we've set a very, very high standard with this one. So please let us know on Twitter. Bharatvaarta is available on Anchor FM, Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, and a bunch of other popular platforms. Do subscribe to us and share this episode if you really liked it. Until next time, please stay safe and take care of yourselves. Jai Hind.